Hello and welcome back, hopefully, if you've been here before. If not, welcome for the first time to DWeb Decoded, the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web's overview and investigation on what's happening in the decentralized web with some of the new players, some of the people who have been around protecting the decentralized web and bringing it forward for some time now, including my guest today, Cindy Cohn. Cindy is Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and, complete disclosure, used to be my boss for many years. We hosted a podcast that continues in my wake called How to Fix the Internet, which gives you an idea of the kind of things that Cindy works on, but not really the depth of it. You have to just sit there while I read the list of all the amazing things you've done, Cindy. So Cindy was the lead lawyer in some of the really seminal fights for rights that I think everybody kind of relies on now in the digital space, especially people in the Web3 and crypto. From 2000 to 2015, Cindy was EFF's legal director. That means she was around defending literally strong cryptography from its government controls, some of the major censorship battles, the rise of the dot-coms, control. God, I can't really, like, there's so much to talk about here. I mean, so to give a context for me, and then I will shut up. I joined EFF in 2005, where we were sort of deep in cryptography, fighting for the right for people to use encryption in a time when not enough people were. And then I watched you lead the organization to really take on the battle against government surveillance. So, and then since then, there have been a million other fires that EFF has fought. So, how does EFF decide what to tackle when your kind of briefing is like, oh yeah, just protect the internet and protect all of digital rights? How did you go, okay, we're going to do government surveillance now?
I mean, it's an art, not a science, right? It really depends on whether there's an issue where we think we have the right tools. You know, EFF is largely lawyers. We have some technologists now too, and we build tech, and we have activists. But are our tools the right tools for this problem? Is it the kind of fight that if we pick the right fight, we can help a lot of people, as opposed to individual kinds of things? Is it something we know that a lot of other people don't know? We don't like to participate and just be a me too along with everybody else. I mean, we'll occasionally do that to show solidarity with groups, but really we feel like when people give us money, they want us to be where other people aren't, and to carve out space where, the market's not going to protect them. The mainstream kind of organizations that don't have deep technical knowledge don't understand it yet, those kinds of things. Encryption was the first one of those. When we were talking about encryption, honestly, it started in 1994.
Right.
To free up encryption from technology. We were talking, this is before the World Wide Web. We were talking about this like future that none of the people in the courts or in the public debates that we were talking with really understood what the hell we were talking about. I'm from the future. I'm here to confuse you, was what I felt like some of my presentations were. And so government surveillance, like we wanted encryption so that people could have a space to have a private conversation. And in the early internet, the governments of the world, and especially the US governments, were really in your threat model, one of the people you wanted to protect them from. So when we discovered that the NSA was effectively tapping into the internet backbone and spying on all the traffic that went by, which was largely unencrypted at that time, it was a natural thing for us to do. If you care about the value of having a private conversation, being able to act in a way where you're not being watched all the time, you have to talk about government surveillance.
So it was something that I remember in my first day as like a sort of young activist. In the first couple of weeks, I think we had a meeting with the developers of a thing called GNU Radio.
Hmm.
And GNU, so this was 2005. GNU Radio, for those not following, it was one of the first programmable radios, right? So up until then, a radio just did one thing, and this thing could do it all. And
Hmm.
these are the things that are in technology all over. But what was interesting is it's totally new, and you and the rest of the lawyers were sitting there going, okay, what are the ramifications for this 10 years down the line?
Hmm.
And I found that fascinating because it was a combination of going, well, we have to anticipate this, partly because that's where we'll be in 10 years' time, and partly because court cases and law cases take that amount of time.
Hmm.
Like you know, the NSA surveillance stuff, like you started it back then, it's still going on. It's still going on I mean, is there progress in Congress right now? There's stuff going on in Congress. There's stuff going on in the courts. It's a long-term battle, all of these things.
I mean, one of EFF's, the National Security Agency has never had their powers cut back. They've only pretty much ever had them increased, except for maybe 3 or 4 times. And one of those was the Church Committee and the creation of the secret FISA court, which was before my time. But since then, 2 or 3 of them have been EFF
Right.
led or joined actions. And yes, there is one right now, Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, which is the congressional authority to do this kind of mass spying, has to be renewed by Congress by the end of the year, or it theoretically expires. And we are hot and heavy in Congress right now trying to make, we'd like it to expire entirely, but we'd also like to see, like, the FBI has a warrant to get access to this information. Like, it shouldn't be an end run around the Fourth Amendment for the FBI, which is the domestic law enforcement. So we've got a package of reforms we're working on. We'll see what Congress does. They are very good at kicking problems down the road. And so there is a good chance that that's what will happen with this one, which I think would be a terrible outcome.
I think it's interesting, and I guess we're going into what EFF also, just for people to know, has all of this funny kind of like insider language, and one of them is, for at least in my English year, was inside baseball, where
Yeah.
people won't know about that. That's the inside. In fact, that term is in itself inside baseball. But
Yeah.
I think
For the Brits.
one of the things that is fascinating being close to it is the outside world. Most people only see the EFF doing something, and many of the other organizations like Fight for the Future and the Creative Commons, when there's a big victory, or
Yep.
we have 24 hours to save the internet.
Yes.
And I think people sometimes, that happens because that's the story that gets propagated, right? There are a million press releases that don't say that people don't get to hear about.
Yep.
But I think that distorts how people think this stuff progresses. Like, if there was one thing you wanted people to know past those headlines, about how you actually either fend off attacks against good uses of technology or promote them, what do you think it would be? Like, what is the thing that EFF does that people don't know about?
Well, I think that in general, we're there. We have a body of knowledge and a body of smart people who are tracking this, so that when I find that change doesn't happen, and then a moment, and you
Right.
can make big change. But if you're not ready, if you don't have people who are ready, you haven't thought about what you want to have happen in those moments, you haven't put in the work, so you have the relationships, so that when something happens, when Apple stood up because it wanted to, it didn't want the government to force it to crack the encryption on an iPhone a few years ago. We got a call from
Right.
Apple early on, like before anybody knew about this, and we had to keep it quiet. And they were still under a gag order, but they were like, "Something's coming. It's about encryption. We know you guys know about encryption. we want you to be ready because we're going to need
Do
you to
you
stand
have
this.
anything on this that, like, that
Yeah.
maybe you could
Have you
pull the
ever heard
binder
about
down, right? Yeah,
encryption and
I think
why it
we've
might
done.
right? And so that's like 20 years in the making, right? Like, and then that moment happened. We were able to help Apple do the right thing, and lots of people were protected on into the future. Now Apple actually even encrypts cloud backups and other things like that. That it's all the years that you don't hear about us that
Yeah.
we're able to continue to thrive and grow and do the things behind the scenes that make those moments happen. They're not it's not like a TV show where, like, you start and by the third act, it's done, and then it's all, you're all tied up in an hour.
Sometimes it's like a TV show, right? Like, I remember, I mean, the example I was going to use of that preparation, right, is Edward Snowden.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
suddenly the world paid attention to it, but like that moment was prepared for
Oh,
by,
yeah.
suddenly we had all this material and people going, wow, do you think this is true? And we're going, oh boy, is it true? Like we
Yeah.
have, court testimony and so forth.
Yeah, no, and the first message I got from Mr. Snowden when I got a message from him through his lawyers was, so do you have standing yet? So what
Right.
does that tell you? Well, standing is a legal doctrine that is one of the thresholds to bringing a lawsuit that says that you've got enough evidence that something actually happened and happened to you such that you can bring a lawsuit. So it's a legal doctrine. So in that, do you have standing yet? I realized that Mr. Snowden had been watching us for a long time, that what he was doing was to try to support us. And we had no idea. I mean, we didn't,
Yeah.
we didn't know. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it may be actually like a TV show that there's a whole lot of stuff you don't see before the actual
Right.
camera turns on.
Right. There are occasional, and of course, going back to this idea is this is the things people see and crystallize a moment. I mean, going back 100 years now, right? Like, so one of the things that was the stuff that I worked on was digital rights management and how bad that
Yep.
continues to be. And
Yep.
it's a very hard, a drum to bang, right? Because people like, if DRM is working the way that people want it, the people who like DRM want it to work, it's invisible. And people just go,
Mhm.
what's the point? And then there was a moment with a thing called the Sony CD rootkit,
Yeah, the rootkit. Yeah.
right? And that was, look it up. We'll put a link in Wikipedia. But it was that moment where people just went, wait, they're doing what?
Yeah.
They're doing like when I put like this, basically music into my computer, it takes over my computer and watches everything I'm doing. And it's Sony. And I paid them for that. And that was like this crystallizing moment that ended up with like Steve Jobs saying he didn't like DRM and a whole sea change in how people thought about it in music.
Yep.
And yeah, suddenly the press is ringing you and like you're giving all of these quotes and things, and it's very exciting. But you sit there in those moments going, thank God I've been researching this for like 20 years.
Yeah.
So, so bringing this sort of back, like, what are the things this is DWeb Decoded. All of the time I was at EFF, we were thinking about decentralization and re-decentralization. Maybe can you talk a little bit about like where that fits into kind of if EFF has a philosophy of how to fix the internet or what's good about the internet? Where does decentralized technology kind of fit into that?
I mean, I think it fits in a couple places. First of all, it's user control, right? You're taking the control of somebody's experience. It may not be all the way to user, but it's a lot closer to user. It's a way that you're taking power and putting it closer to the edges of the experience. And the original story of the internet is that's what the internet was for. It was so a bomb couldn't take out an entire infrastructure of communications. I mean, that's the kind of Defense Department version of the internet. We all know that these stories are a bit overblown or apocryphal, but taking centers of power and putting them closer to the actual users is something that is kind of core to EFF. I used to say, when you go online, your rights go with you, right? That it's all about you, the center piece of this, or you or your community. It doesn't have to be individualistic, but it's not centralized power. I think that's one piece of EFF where decentralization has always been kind of the underlying philosophy behind a lot of user empowerment. And then I think, starting, gosh, it was a few years ago now, probably, I don't know, closer to 8 or 9 years ago, we started realizing that a lot of the free speech and privacy battles that we were fighting to try to help protect people, that rights part of your rights go with you, were being negatively impacted by the fact that we had centralization. We had the rise of a few tech giants, and many of them had a privacy invasive business model, the surveillance business model, which is why Google is so rich and why Facebook is so rich. That model was hostile to users' interests, and that we probably couldn't get at it by just kind of getting at it directly. That we needed to really, if we were going to have headway on free speech and privacy issues, we had to have decentralization be central to our strategy.
Yeah.
Because the answer, I always say this, the answer to a bad dictator isn't to pound on the dictator and try to make him a nicer dictator, right? The answer is to
Or
get
a
rid of
good dictator, right?
yeah, even
Like,
a good,
yeah.
right? Benevolent dictatorship is very efficient. Blah blah blah. I think that the point is like there's a lot of people who are upset about the rise of the tech giants who really just wanted to pound on Mark Zuckerberg for not being a nicer person. Or now we're all living in this time where we're realizing exactly how bad a person Elon Musk can be. But to me, that's like all power to you, and I certainly do my share of grousing about the individual men and their positions. But like, that isn't the problem. The problem isn't that the men in charge are not nicer men or better men or even not men at all. The problem
Right.
is that there's one or two people in charge.
Right. It's like it has this feeling of a codependent relationship where you're sort of like going, I can change them,
Yeah.
whether you're the government or an individual user, you just go, actually, how about we just kind of again, the other analogy is I was thinking about this conversation and I wanted to talk about something that was definitely sort of internal at EFF. Which was that progress, right? I think it was longer than 8 years ago. I mean, I remember in like
Yeah,
2007, 2008, we were
you're
like,
probably right.
oh, this is not going the right way. And, I think that there's this area, there was this period of bargaining, right? And there still is, where you're
Right.
sort of going, okay, actually the big actor is not the government right now. It's still the government, but like, Facebook or whoever has this power to do good and bad. So we will target them, right? We
Hmm.
will challenge them on what they're doing. Um, and that seemed to be like the bargaining phase, right? Of the grief of the internet. And it's still very powerful. Like, I feel like one of the really powerful things that people don't recognize at EFF was who has your back,
Yeah.
right? Um, and again, I will just brief people because, again, I feel like it's, inside baseball in many ways. Who has your back was for many years a project where EFF would do a kind of ranking of tech companies. They would have little tick boxes like, if the government comes with a subpoena to this company, do they fight back, or do they have a process, a documented process, stuff like that? And people would often quiz me about that, or people would write about it and go, I can't believe that, like you said, Google was good. and we go, and we go, well, when did we say Google was good? I said, well, you gave it 3 stars. You
Right.
go, out of 5, and the other 2 were like, awful things that it does. Um, but I knew the strategy and I explained to people on a one by one. So maybe you can explain that, because I see that as like the perfect indication of that bargaining. How do
Yeah.
you live? how do you make things better or protect things from getting worse in a centralized system?
Yeah, I mean, you have to do both, right? You have to work to make the centralized system better, even as you work to make sure that it isn't the only game in town. But yeah, so the "Who Has Your Back" idea was really, I mean, it always cracks me up because we gave the companies gold stars if they did certain things with standing with their users. And I used to have like CEOs of really gigantic companies calling me and wanting gold stars, which just felt very strange from the position of a tiny little nonprofit.
And sort of going, look, if we do this,
Right.
do we get another star?
Right. And we were like, yeah. But really the thing that we harnessed with Who Has Your Back wasn't EFF's decision making. It was trying to find the best in class among these companies and challenge all the other companies to rise to the
To do
occasion. So
better, right?
everything that we put in the Who Has Your Back, especially in the first years, was something that somebody was doing. So Google was early on in doing transparency reports where they would give an annual report, or I think it was quarterly now, of all the times that they get requests from governments around the world for information about you and users about you. We thought the world would be better if all the companies had to do that. So we gave Google a gold star and challenged all the other companies because they weren't going to get a gold star if they didn't do it. Same with letting you know if law enforcement shows up and wants information about you and you're a customer of the service. That was something actually Facebook did early on, back when they were Facebook. And we gave the gold star in order to challenge everybody to do it. And lo and behold, it worked. Like, it turns out peer pressure is a really powerful thing, and competitive pressure is really powerful. And it's, more powerful than a little nonprofit in the mission shaming you. So we harnessed that power and we got a race to the top among all of those kinds of things. That did mean sometimes we had to say nice things about the companies, but millions of people got more protection for it. So I'm going to use all the tools. I mean, like, I won't use, there are some tools I wouldn't use, but I'm not afraid.
You're not
to
going to
use
hack them. You're not going to take advantage of EFF's mighty DEF CON influence.
I say, you shouldn't violate people's privacy to demonstrate that people's privacy can be violated. That's a pretty basic, easy rule. But harnessing the powers of competition and how these companies like look towards each other to try to make everything better for other people is, like, I think, completely fair game.
It's a huge magnifier. I think if you go back and look at those, I think that the indicator from the outside world is it would go Facebook 3 stars, blah, Google 3 stars, and then at the bottom it would have some far smaller organization that we knew was doing amazing things and like was demonstrating that was possible, right? And they would be at the bottom and they would get 5 stars. And that would drive these giants crazy because they were like, who's this podunk, like, potential competitor that's going to eat our lunch, right? Coming up. Like, you have to, like, make sure that they're not at the top of the list.
Right.
And I always sort of like laughed at like the idea that we were like putting these companies in a good light when, there were like these small companies that were really trying to do the right thing.
Yep.
And ultimately that, you say good dictator, bad dictator, that was kind of the model. Like, these people claim you can't do this. You can do this, but maybe you can't do this and be as big as those companies are. So at the same time that happened, the other big success story for me was Let's Encrypt.
Huge.
And Let's Encrypt wasn't just EFF. We were a small part of like a sort of, I remember when was it Project Chocolate? Was it
Project Chocolate? Yeah, that's what they called. That's what the text called it.
Right. So it was people had to quietly kind of pull it together. Can you explain what Let's Encrypt is and what it did?
Sure. I mean, this is honestly, Let's Encrypt was a thing that EFF and a bunch of other organizations, Alex Halderman at the University of Michigan, some folks at Mozilla, were starting to think about, which is, how do we, as I mentioned, the NSA is sitting on the networking and watching all the traffic that goes through that is not encrypted. And that was one of the ways that they were spying on everybody. That's because the underlying technology called certificate authorities in before Let's Encrypt happened was something that you had to buy. It was expensive. It was hard to do. If you had a website and you wanted to protect your users and make sure that your users were actually coming to you and not a fake site when they were transiting the internet, you had to pay a lot of money and organize a thing and keep it updated and all of those things. And so the idea of Let's Encrypt was, let's make certificate authorities, like encrypting the web traffic, dead easy and free, and see what kind of uptake we get. So this was something that we were putting together before Snowden. After Snowden, people may remember there was one of those slides that had, Danny, you had a shirt that said this, right? That encrypted here, but in between it wasn't encrypted, with a little smiley face,
I
right?
dressed up as that for Halloween. I dressed up as a giant Post-it note, and because there was a smiley face in the middle of it where they went, "Oh, this is where we will tap all the communications," and my head poked out of the Post-it note as a smiley face. But yes, that was
that was so the idea of Let's Encrypt was to make that smile a frown from the NSA's perspective by encrypting all the traffic in between the servers. And the reason it had to be so quiet is that there was a business that people had doing that, and we were going to try to, we were the people
commoditizing that.
Giving
just
you free
making
coffee
it free,
as opposed to the $5 coffee that you might buy. And so we launched it, and it's a consortium. It's run by the internet. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's sorry. It's a consortium. It's got a lot of companies involved now. And I think we've encrypted like 90% of web traffic now, like way over. A huge amount of web traffic is done. And this is a way where this was a situation in which, rather than deploying lawyers or deploying activists, we deployed a technology and basically made the world, much safer. EFF runs one of the things, something called CertBot, which is one of the things that you can use on your website to be part of the Let's Encrypt network.
So this is one of the examples I always use in the Web3 kind of crypto space to kind of describe how you execute change through technology, right? Which is that was something that was built that gave you something that up until that point we used to have to like argue either in a sort of like ideological or aspirational way, where we go, wouldn't it be great if everything was encrypted and then the NSA wouldn't spy on everybody? And then this team built a thing which was free, and rather than have to go and fill a million bureaucratic forms, you ran a script, and it just went, yep, it's all encrypted now. And that just went from, tiny percentage of the world's web traffic was invulnerable to NSA collection, to 90% of the web traffic. Yep. And it's not just technical, right? Like if cryptography had been illegal, then that wouldn't have been possible, right? If the companies and others had really fought against that, I think they could have killed it. And there was a lot of negotiating with people and saying, look, so for instance, you had to, for Let's Encrypt to work, you had to get that certificate into the browsers. The browsers had to recognize that Let's Encrypt was a legit organization, which meant you had to go to them and you had to say, hey, we're the EFF, or we're these people. We're a legitimate project. And bang, right? Like you transform billions of people's lives, and and the fact that no one notices it is good, right? Is a sign that it's worked well.
It's a ISRG, the Internet Security Research Group, is the consortium that does it. But this idea that you need to encrypt in between your servers was something that we had been pounding on Google to do for a very long time. And they were like, well, we'd like to do it, but it's not on the top of our list.
And no one else is doing it. So do people really care?
And then when Snowden leaks came out suddenly, and we had let's encrypt pretty close to ready. I don't remember the exact timing, but we were not far apart. Suddenly it popped to the top of their list. And they were on board for it, and so these is how this stuff interacts. Like we were working and working and working, and suddenly a moment comes. We're able to seize the moment and play off and make something come up and make it real in a way where it might not have happened without that Snowden moment.
And I think also this thing of preparing this material, preparing these talking points, preparing kind of ammunition,
Mm-hmm.
probably the wrong phrase, but like preparing useful things, right? That people within companies and institutions and governments who get it are able to use internally. Like
Absolutely.
I knew that there was a faction in Google and Facebook who
Yep.
were really worried about this.
Yep.
Really worried about government surveillance and how could they argue with a bunch of people we're talking about, daily users and speed of connections, and like feeding those people, not directly, but just something that they could read and reuse, meant that they could make arguments in the boardroom.
Yep.
And that's another. So, okay. So bringing this back. So if you are lobbying or whatever, like if you're having a conversation now with the people building the decentralized web, right?
Mm-hmm.
Building all of these fantastic tools. There's dozens out there. The rest of the time I'm interviewing those people. What is that conversation? It's like the GNU Radio meeting, right? It's like meeting with the secret faction at a company that wants to do the right thing. What would you say to them? What should they be doing and thinking about? What questions do you have for them?
Oh man, that's such a good question. I mean, I think I think first of all, you should look at the fights that need to be fought in order to make your way clear and start helping EFF and other organizations that are doing that. And I actually think people need to think a little more broadly than just crypto and the blockchain. And I'm thinking specifically about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act,
Right.
and other, because we want a decentralized world that is interoperable with the current world if we really want people to be able to make these shifts.
Right.
And think about those kinds of what are the obstacles and begin to invest in trying to help make it so that they don't end up being obstacles. When you get to that part, there's tech, building the right tech is really important, but getting the right tech supported by law and policy and people is one of the things that's really important. And it might be that we can't do it right away, but we want to be ready. And we want to be ready, as someone who's been watching this, we want to be ready with all the good stories, all the ways in which this technology helps people. It's very important in the broader public debate, whether we're talking to people in black robes or judges or Congress or regulators or just even ordinary people, that we have a big list of stories that are positive, good. How is this making life better for people? And honestly, bonus points if it's making things better for people who aren't you, um,
Yeah.
who are marginalized, maybe who are different, or who are like kind of helping people. And I mean you just in terms of like
Not
sometimes
me.
computer programmers, well, not you personally, but that sometimes people who have tech skills are really focused on the things that make people with tech skills life better. And I think one of the things that I will tell you is very helpful, all the way from encryption, right? We started when we freed up encryption. I went in front of a federal judge here in San Francisco and I talked about human rights. I talked about science. I talked about math. I talked about why the constitutional values of free speech ought to be applied to this weird new world that you're not even living in yet, but you're going to be living in 10 years, and why we needed to set up I joke sometimes that EFF are the plumbers of freedom, right? We needed to get this clog out of the way so that the water could flow freely so that innovation and people could thrive. And so I think for the decentralization community, making sure that you're front loading those stories and that they're real. They're not like, oh, I thought of a way that this could help people, but you're actually
Right.
talking to the people you want to help. and building something that they actually need and want. That's the other kind of traditional tech problem, is a technologist sitting in their own little room imagining what it's like to be a person in a foreign country facing repression and building a thing that they would want if they were that person. That's like not nearly so helpful to that person as actually going and asking them what they need and prioritizing what they need, if that's the role you want to serve. And so
Yeah.
I think that thinking through those kinds of things, both on the how could it go wrong and who am I helping and how do I lift up their stories and really have an honest story to tell about why it's useful. I'll give you another example. When we went to the Supreme Court to try to free up peer-to-peer file sharing, right? The copyright owners didn't like peer-to-peer file sharing. We took a case called Grokster up to the Supreme Court. We did not win, but we also did not lose. It was a weird situation. But we had a passel of stories about why peer-to-peer file sharing, first of all, was not created to facilitate infringement and wasn't had many uses that were not the ones facilitating infringement. We didn't pretend like people weren't infringing using peer-to-peer
Right.
file sharing. They absolutely were, but that there's a baby in that bathwater and that we
Right.
can't throw out the bathwater. And I think for decentralization, a lot of the bad news in the cryptocurrency side is making people want to throw out the bathwater in a way that the community really needs to lift up the babies
Yeah.
and help make sure that you can't talk about one without talking about the other. Because I think about it that way, but I don't know that that's the very high profile story on the other side that is like, oh, decentralization
Crime,
means
four
crypto
horsemen of
means,
the infopocalypse, kind of
yeah, it means
the
Ponzi schemes and all of that kind of thing. And so I think that for people in this community, the answer is to not just attack the bad story; it's to lift up the good stories.
and make them happen as well. I
Mhm.
think that I think it's. I mean, this is a key thing of what we try to do at FFTW and the Filecoin
Totally.
Foundation, right? Is go out and not and genuinely, because we're going, okay, there is a natural path to technology where I think one of the old running stories is that erotica and porn is like one of the first adopters of
Totally.
any of these new technologies, right? It grows in its own natural way, and it's very natural for bad actors to seize an opportunity because that's what they do. Their
Right.
chances, right? Like they look at something and they go, okay, how can I make this work for me? And so sometimes you really have to push a lot of weight into the public goods, the public interest work,
Mhm.
because it will benefit, um, but it has to get there in time. The example I would use as well is, again, it's sort of interesting talking to people because people will often go, well, we can't do that because like we'll get sued, but this is okay. And you go, you know, that line
Right.
between good thing that we could do but we would get sued for
Right.
and good thing that we could do that would be fine is defined, right? Like that's
Right.
not just come down from God. So the example I use is Tor, right? So
Mhm.
for those of you who don't know, Tor is something that protects your anonymity online. It lets you go to the Googles and the Amazons of the world and they don't know who you are. Um, there are obviously people who use Tor for, or just anonymity in general, for bad things, but it's not the only thing that they use it for. And the Tor team spent a lot of time working on making sure that the good people got to use it.
Yep.
So I think that,
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think that's something that we need to sort of concentrate in this space. Well, we're sort of running out of time, unfortunately.
I know.
So I'm.
It just
I
flew
mean,
by.
I know. We could talk for hours, and you know what? We already have. In that, if people can go to the "How to Fix the Internet" podcast, there are 2 series of you and me talking
Yep.
to amazing people, and then Jason took up the helm
Yep.
with you, and it still continues to be a great resource for finding out how to fix the internet. How do people get to it, Cindy?
Just how to it's on all your podcast channels, whether that's Apple or Spotify or anything. So you can come to EFF's website if you don't want to deal with those centralized platforms, and you can get it directly from us. The conceit of the podcast is, what does the world look like if we get it right? EFF spends a lot of time wallowing in all the ways that things are broken online. And I have to admit, this was me. I intentionally made myself make a podcast that focuses on and gives us a vision for a better world. And it's been fun. It's my excuse to get to talk to people
Yeah.
who are thinking that way. So
It's super inspiring. I found it very inspiring being on it and listening to all these people. It kind of inspired me to, I'm sorry, but it inspired me to move to work more closely with all of those people. But we're still buddies.
we're all
We
in
love
it's
you
all
at
in the same
EFF.
family.
Yeah.
We it's all love. I just miss you every day because I don't get to get, I don't have anybody going in my life anymore.
Well, well, perhaps we should have you on more often, and it would be great to get an update of how well things are going, rather than just the disasters and the victories in small
Thanks so
parts.
much.
All right, thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you
Bye.
everybody for watching.